to communities about the risk. Up till then, it sort of gave people the impression that you could stay and defend if you wanted to. Whereas now, people have been much, much less polite, I guess. They're saying, don't. This is unprecedented. You've never seen fires like this before in your life. You need to just leave. And the second part is we did a lot of science around the protection elements. So building standards were reviewed really intensively, and there were some pretty big changes as to how we design houses and how we plan the position of houses in the land.
Interesting. So do you believe that those measures, warning people much more bluntly about evacuating when fires are happening and also reshaping how building is planned, do you think that those have made a real difference this time around?
We actually don't know. It's a little bit too early to tell, because after a major fire like this, we would do a period of intense investigation. I do know that some of the shelters that we designed post Black Saturday are being used right now. And I know they're using the school at Canberra River, for instance. And I was talking to one of my colleagues that actually designed that solution. And it is both a nervous wait, but also kind of a good feeling to know that something we built as a shelter for bushfire is being used right now. The community has been sheltering in that now for several days.
Now, one suggestion that's been repeated is that there should just be more controlled burns, basically reduce the fuel sources for these fires. What do you think of that idea?
I think it's a very simplistic way to look at it, and it simply hasn't worked. We've seen in these really catastrophic fire weather conditions that even areas that were fuel reduced through controlled burning, they're burning again. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, with climate change, we're seeing the window where we can effectively fuel reduce safely getting smaller and smaller and smaller going forward.
Well, given that there's still a few months left in the summer, do you expect these conditions to worsen drastically?
Unfortunately, yes, they are. Tomorrow is going to be a really bad day. We have very severe fire weather conditions predicted. That's going to cover a large part of the eastern seaboard of Australia. So we've got basically the beginning of the fire season now. We would normally only have had a few small fires at this stage. Now we have much more intense fires covering literally the entire country.
Cormac Farrell is an environmental scientist with the company Unlocked, working on bushfire protection. He joined us from Canberra. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for this.
Democratic presidential contender Andrew Yang talks openly and frequently about his son, Christopher, who's on the autism spectrum. Here's Yang during the most recent Democratic debate.
I have a son with special needs. And to me, special needs is a new normal in this country. How many of you all have a family member or a friend or a neighbor with special needs or autism? If you look around, most hands went up.
And here
Andrew Yang's plans for disabled people. He told the group what it was like when his son Christopher, who was 3 at the time, received his autism diagnosis.
So we were first-time parents, and Christopher had struggles, but as a first-time parent, you don't know if that's the correct thing. Maybe 2 girls act like this, maybe 2 girls act like this. And when we got the diagnosis, it was actually a relief for me and my wife, because we're like, okay, this is something that we now understand, and we can bring resources to bear.
Yang said he recognizes that not everyone has the resources. Autism can be a costly and complex diagnosis. It can vary widely. In an interview, Yang explained why he's decided to make his son's story part of his campaign.
Well, I would have no idea how not to talk about it in the sense that part of our
the CEO of Christopher. Jessie Witherell is one of the co-founders of the Iowa City autism community. She said she hadn't heard a candidate talk about autism this way before.
Autism is such a common condition. So many of us know somebody who's on the autism spectrum, but yet we don't have leaders who talk about autism in a positive light.
She drew a contrast between how Yang and President Trump talk about autism. Recently, Trump has mocked Greta Thunberg, a 16-year-old climate activist who is on the autism spectrum. This week, Yang rolled out a new plan to fund research and support children with disabilities, as well as their families. Ari Heyman welcomes some parts of Yang's plan, including his commitment to ending seclusion as a punishment in schools and expanded federal aid for disabled students. Naiman is a senior research associate at Harvard Law School's Project on Disability, and he's consulted on the plans of several Democrats running for president. But he also had some concerns, particularly the fact that Yang's proposal focuses only on children, rather than also including problems faced by disabled adults. We spoke over Skype.
That's a sore spot in the disability community. Often you will see the public very quick to talk about cute disabled children, but when those children grow up, being very reluctant to provide supports and services in order to have a life with dignity and independence.
He said that Yang's plan has a lot of admirable goals, but so far not a lot of specifics. One big question is how Yang's signature freedom dividend that would give every American $1,000 a month would work with the existing web of disability programs. Advocates are worried that the disabled could lose access to benefits and services unless Yang's plan is finely tuned. Yang didn't get into specifics on which existing disability programs would stack with the freedom dividend in our interview, and it isn't something the plan his campaign release this week addressed. But Yang says that's not the point.
Human value and economic value are not the same things, and everyone has intrinsic value. That's one of the core messages of the campaign. We have to make a society that works for all of us, able or non, on the spectrum or no or not.
Yang acknowledges that campaigning for president has been hard on his family, but he says the things he and his wife have learned from advocating for their son are part of the reason he's in this race at all. Juana Summers, NPR News.
Knots have been used by people since ancient times. There are thousands of different kinds of knots, everything from simple knots used to tie shoes to the far more specialized ones used by, say, mountaineers. Scientists have now come up with some basic rules that can be used to predict how a knot will perform. NPR's Nell Greenfield-Boyce reports.
There's a whole field of mathematics that studies knots theoretically to explore abstract properties of idealized curves.
But that's not what you care about if you're, for example, a sailor or a climber and you need to tie something which holds.
Vishal Patil is a graduate student at MIT. He's interested in the mechanics of real-world knots. He says, take two simple knots, the reef knot and the granny knot. They look very similar, but behave very differently.
So if you pull on the reef knot, it tends to hold, and if you pull on the granny knot, it tends to slip quite easily.
He says there's been no theoretical framework, no set of rules to explain why these knots do what they do. But then he heard of something new, a special kind of fiber developed by colleagues at MIT. This fiber changes color when it's under strain.
And we thought that this was a good opportunity to learn more about real physical knots using their system.
The research team tied a couple of different knots in this fiber, and the color changes let them see how forces and strain were distributed inside the knots. They used this information to fine-tune some computer simulations of knots. After that, they took what they'd learned and came up with a system for identifying strong knots and weak knots. Patil says one key thing, the thing that separates the reef knot from the granny knot, is twist.
Twist is quite important in how knots behave.
He says when you have lots of twists going in opposite directions along the knot, it locks the knot.
But if lots of twists are going in the same direction, then the whole thing can roll out.
Other key features include the amount of friction in the knot and its overall complexity. To see how well their system could predict a knot's behavior, they took 6 different knots and assessed how stable they should be. Then they tested that experimentally.
We tried tying different knots and loading them with weight and seeing how much weight we needed to get them to slip.
Their predictions were right. The research is reported in the journal Science, and it could someday be used to design new kinds of knots that are custom made for certain jobs. Nell Greenfield-Boyce, NPR News.
It's All Things Considered from NPR News.
China is upgrading a high highway in northern Pakistan, and some critics see the improvements as mostly having a military angle.
It improves the capacity for cross-border mobility, troop mobility, and other military logistics.
Meanwhile, those countries say they hope to transform the road into a key trade corridor. That story, details ahead in 20 minutes on WHYY's All Things Considered.
I'm Annette John Hall, co-host of The Why. In each episode, we take a deep dive into an issue that matters in your community through conversations with beat reporters and people in the know. It's a local take that explains the forces shaping events in our region and gives you a fuller view. You can hear The Why every Monday through Thursday night at 5:45 on 90.9 WHYY FM.
America's long-term role in Afghanistan remains uncertain, but an Afghan version of Sesame Street is still on the air and still promoting positive values. The challenge for the Afghan writers, producers, and puppeteers: help kids deal with conflict and war.
We talk about fear, disappointment, anger, and how to control that. We talk about empathy.
Sesame Street in Afghanistan, the world.
Join us for The World this evening from 8 to 9 on 90.9 WHYY.
In recent years, thousands of teachers across the country have walked out of their classrooms, demanding better conditions for students and themselves.
We have stagnant teacher salaries in many of these places, coupled with, especially in places like Oakland and Los Angeles, skyrocketing housing prices.
I'm Kimberly Adams. How teachers look back on the walkouts now. Next time on Marketplace.
This evening from 6:30 to 7 on WHYY FM.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Procter & Gamble, maker of Metamucil. Metamucil Premium Blend contains plant-based psyllium fiber, is made with natural flavors and colors, and is sweetened with stevia leaf extract. Learn more at metamucil.com. From the Wallace Foundation, fostering improvements in learning and enrichment for disadvantaged children, and the vitality of the arts for everyone. Ideas at wallacefoundation.org. And from the Annie E. Casey Foundation.
From NPR News, this is All Things Considered. I'm Elsa Chang.
And I'm Mary Louise Kelly. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has called off his planned trip to Ukraine to deal with a crisis at the embassy in Baghdad. Pro-Iranian militia members tried to storm that embassy earlier this week. That is just one of the foreign policy challenges facing the Trump administration in the new year. NPR State Department correspondent Michelle Kellerman is tracking all of them. She joins me now. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Mary Louise.
Start with Baghdad. What is the situation now? What's the latest?
So those pro-Iranian militia members and their supporters have dispersed. The Trump administration's beefing up security. But this is clearly not over. I mean, remember, this whole thing started when an Iranian-backed militia fired on a U.S. base in Iraq and killed an American contractor. The U.S. retaliated, and the Iranian-backed group said 24 of its members were killed. So this is a situation that has been escalating.